Human beings, and in fact most primate species more generally, are social species. That is, we thrive in environments where we are able to interact with others, and one of the purest forms of torture really is isolation, being deprived of social contact with other individuals. And so, in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about social psychology, which is the study of how people's thoughts, feelings, and actions are affected, and of course, as a result, also affect other people. Um, I'll be discussing three central themes regarding social psychology. One is social cognition, which is how we think about and interpret both ourselves and others. Social influence, which is how situational factors and other people can affect us. And social relations, which is how we develop and are affected by interpersonal relationships, including things like prejudice, aggression, altruism, and attraction. So we're going to start off by talking about attributions and attitudes. In other words, our thoughts about others. Specifically, attributions are attempts to essentially explain behaviors, usually of other individuals. And when we go to explain the behavior of other people, there's a very common mistake that we make when we attempt to explain other people's behaviors. It's such a common mistake, and it's so fundamental that it's actually called the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error refers to the fact that when we make attributions, or when we attempt to explain why do people behave the way that we do, we tend to over-attribute the role of personological or individual factors, and we tend to underemphasize the role that environmental factors play in people's behavior. So, in other words, if you're driving in traffic and somebody cuts you off, you're likely to attribute that person's behavior to a characterological or a personality trait of that individual. Okay, that person is a jerk. That person is a bad driver. These are things that we are attributing to the individual, but we often fail to consider the fact that that person may have cut us off because they were in a hurry to get to the hospital because they're visiting a sick relative. The self-serving bias, on the other hand, refers to the fact that when we attempt to explain our own behavior as opposed to other people's, we tend to favor internal attributions when it comes to our successes. That is, we think that we do well because we are good at doing things, but we attribute our failures to external attributions. I didn't do well because something interfered with my ability to do well on this particular task. So, we tend to attribute external events for our own driving mistakes as being the cause. We are not bad drivers, but rather there are external factors that cause us to drive badly. But when we see other people driving badly, we tend to overestimate the role of that behavior being characteristic of the individual, and that's the fundamental attribution error. One explanation for why we tend to be so likely to make this fundamental attribution error is that we tend to jump to internal personal explanations because human personalities and behaviors, they tend to be more salient or more noticeable than situational factors. And so this is referred to as the saliency bias. It helps explain why people will sometimes suggest that a victim is at fault, so-called blaming the victim. The self-serving bias refers to the fact that we tend to take credit for our successes and externalize our failures, as I mentioned previously. And this is potentially motivated by a desire to maintain positive self-esteem as well as a good public image. This discrepancy between the attributions that we make when it comes to our own behavior and the attributions we make when it comes to other people's behavior is also referred to as the actor-observer effect. That is, as actors, we tend to look more at situational or environmental factors to explain ourselves, but as observers, we tend to make dispositional or personality attributions. And this may in part be because of the fact that when we ourselves are involved in a situation, we usually have more information about the environmental factors, and that could be one of the reasons that we're more likely to explain things in terms of those situational factors, whereas we're less likely to have that information if we're observing other people's behavior. Now, these attributional biases can also be explained in part by cultural factors. That is, we've talked about the idea that some cultures tend to be more individualistic, whereas some tend to be more collectivistic. In individualistic cultures, you're more likely to see these attributions toward attributing things to internal, stable personality types of factors. Whereas in collectivist cultures that we've talked about, they're more likely to define their members as, or they're more likely to define individuals rather as members of their social network, and so they may tend to be more aware of situational factors and therefore less likely to make this fundamental attribution error. They're also less likely to fall victim to the self-serving bias, because in part the ideal person in more collectivist cultures is someone who is aware of their own shortcomings and continually works to overcome them, not someone who thinks of himself very highly. Okay. Now, when social psychologists study attitudes, they often measure each of three components: affective, cognitive, and behavioral. And when we talk about attitudes, these are learned predispositions that cause us to respond to objects, people, and events in particular ways. So when we observe and respond to the world around us, we seldomly are completely neutral, but rather our responses toward certain subjects tend to reflect our attitudes, and we tend to learn these attitudes from both our direct experience as well as from watching others, particularly from watching our parents. And although attitudes often begin in early childhood, they're not necessarily permanent. In fact, one way to change attitudes is to make direct persuasive appeals, and so many marketing agencies attempt to do just that. They attempt to persuade you to change your attitude to be consistent with the way that they would like you to view things. Perhaps an even more efficient strategy to change people's attitudes is to create what has been termed cognitive dissonance. Dissonance refers to contradictions between our attitudes and behaviors, which cause a sense of a feeling of discomfort, and this can cause us to change our attitudes in order to agree with our behaviors. So this was investigated in a very classic research study now, in fact, in one of the best-known tests of cognitive dissonance. The researchers, Leon Festinger and Merrill Carlsmith, back in 1959, they paid participants either $1 or $20 to lie to other fellow participants that a boring experimental task in which they had just participated was actually enjoyable and fun, which clearly they didn't believe that. But those who were paid $1 subsequently changed their minds and actually reported that their attitudes toward it were more positive than those who were paid $20. Now, you would think that maybe getting paid $20 to do a boring task would make it more enjoyable, right? But in fact, it was the people that were paid $1 that found it more enjoyable. And the explanation for this is that if people were given only $1, then they didn't really have sufficient justification for lying, and so there was this cognitive dissonance that resulted. They didn't enjoy the task, but at the same time they didn't have justification for saying that they enjoyed the task, and so there was a discrepancy between what they did, their behavior, and the attitude toward the task. So they changed the attitude, and they reported that they enjoyed the task more than they actually did. Now, it's important to note that back in 1959, $20 was more like about 200 in terms of today's dollars, based on inflation. So that's a pretty good reason for saying that a task is entertaining or not boring, and therefore there's little or no cognitive dissonance that results, and therefore little or no attitude change in terms of whether they had enjoyed the task. Now we're going to begin to look at how other people affect us, which, as I said previously, is referred to as social influence. And specifically, we're going to talk about 3 types of social influence: conformity, obedience, and group processes. So, in a very classic study on the topic of conformity, people were asked which line, A, B, or C, in the diagram on the right there, matches the length of the line on the left. Now, clearly the answer is B. That's pretty obvious, but the researcher that conducted this experiment in 1951, Solomon Asch, found that 6 of the 7 participants who participated in this study who were Confederates. A Confederate is somebody who's working with the experimenter, and is believed to be a participant by the true participants, but the Confederates are actually part of the experiment. They had lied about which of the lines was the longest. They said that which line matched the standard line. The Confederates would say line A, and when the Confederates had said line A, more than a third of the participants that were true participants in the study also said A. That is, they chose the obviously incorrect choice after they had seen that other people, again, who were Confederates, were choosing the wrong line. And this study has now been conducted, many times, in fact, many different cultures, and the results are often very similar. So, why would people choose line A when that's clearly the wrong answer? In other words, how can we explain why it is that people actually conform, particularly in this case when they know that they're doing the wrong thing? Well, one explanation is called normative social influence. That is, often people conform to group pressure out of a need for approval and acceptance by the group. So norms are just expected behaviors that are adhered to by members of a particular group. And most often norms are quite subtle and implicit, but the behaviors often reflect your desire to conform, and also the power of normative social influence. Anytime you see somebody do something and then you engage in that same behavior after seeing somebody else do it, that's a normative social influence. And informational social influence occurs, for example, when you conform not to gain somebody's approval, which would be normative social influence, but rather because you assume that that the person that you are behaving similar toward has more information than you do, right? That they must know something that you do. And so this could be, one of the explanations behind why people chose A. Maybe people thought, oh, I must not be seeing it correctly. They must have a better view of this than I do for some reason. And the third explanation has to do with reference groups, which refers to the people that we most admire, like, and want to resemble. This is exactly why professional athletes will be paid millions of dollars to endorse products by advertisers, because they know that if somebody from our reference group is engaging in a behavior, that increases the likelihood that we will engage in that behavior as well. Okay, so that's conformity. Now we're going to talk about obedience, and this once again is a very classic study in the history of psychology. So this was a study that was designed by a psychologist by the name of Stanley Milgram, who recruited people for his study and told them that he was looking at the effect of electric shock on the ability to learn. And so he told participants that there were some people who were going to be teachers and some who are going to be learners. Okay, the learners would be the ones that are trying to learn the information and who would be receiving the shock, and the teachers were the ones that would be reading the words and then administering the shocks anytime a person answered incorrectly. Now, in fact, all people in the study, all research participants, were teachers, and the learner was a Confederate. Now, you'll recall that a Confederate, as I just described a few minutes ago, is somebody who research participants think is another participant, but who is really part of the actual study. And Stanley Milgram was not actually interested in the effects of punishment on learning, but rather he was interested in whether people would obey an authority figure who was prompting and commanding him or her to shock another human being. So before Milgram even conducted his study, he sent out surveys to the public as well as to psychiatrists to ask them what they thought the results of the experiment were going to be. You know, in other words, did they think that anyone would go beyond, for example, 150 millivolts or 150 volts of a shock? And most people did not believe that anyone would. And certainly nobody predicted that participants would administer a shock at the 300 volt level. Yet, fully 2/3 of the participants in Milgram's study went all the way to the end of the scale and continued administering these shocks even when the learner had stopped responding. That is, you know, he was. They were told at the beginning of the study. The learner mentioned that he had a heart condition, and the reason that they did this was because, you know, it was sort of a justification for, you know, why he shouldn't be receiving shocks. But as I said, people continued to administer the shock, and they would go all the way to the end where it said XXX. You know, past the point of extreme danger from the shock. This was the highest voltage, and as I said, you know, fully 2/3 of participants administered this highest level. So, and this study was then expanded upon, and they looked at what are some of the factors that seem to influence people's likelihood of administering the highest shock levels. And they found that if the orders were given by an ordinary person, or the experimenter was given orders by phone, that far fewer, only about 20% of people, would administer the 450 volt shocks. So, you know, if somebody is standing over you in a white lab coat and they're believed to be an authority figure, you know, that seems to be a pretty important factor, because when the orders are given by, you know, just a regular person who is also a Confederate, you're much less likely to do it. If the learner is close by, that is 1.5 feet away, rather than in a different room, which was the case in Milgram's original study, people are also less likely to do it. If the teacher holds the learner's hand on the shock plate, you can see that decreases the likelihood. If the teacher chooses the level of the shock, you know, virtually no one would give that voltage. And if the teacher watches 2 other people disobey, you can see that the likelihood of them administering the highest shock levels drops down to only about 10%. If the teacher watches 2 others obey, on the other hand, it actually increases to just over about 70%. So those are some of the important factors that seem to influence people's willingness to obey an authority figure. So there seem to be 4 important factors in obedience. One is the legitimacy and closeness of the authority figure. So, based on some of the data that we just looked at, when the orders came from an ordinary person and when the experimenter left the room and then gave orders by phone, we saw that participants' obedience dropped from again, about 2/3 or 66% in the original study to only about 20%. Remoteness of the victim seems to be important as well. So when the learner was only 1.5 feet away from the teacher, obedience dropped to 40%. And when the teacher had to actually hold the learner's hand, obedience was only about 30%. So this is in contrast to when the learner was in the other room, which was the case in the original study. Assignment of responsibility is an important factor. When the teacher simply read the list of words while another delivered the shock, obedience jumped to almost 94%. So, if somebody is, not directly responsible, then they'll continue with the study. They'll continue reading the words, even knowing that a shock will be administered because they feel that they're not responsible. But when the teacher was responsible for choosing the shock level, we saw that only about 3% of those obeyed. And finally, modeling or imitating others appears to be an important factor. When teachers watched others disobey, only about 10% administered the highest shock level, but after seeing others obey, it jumped to over 70%, as we saw. 3 additional factors that seem to be important in obedience are socialization, which can help to explain many instances of mindless obedience to immoral requests from people in positions of authority. For example, participants in Milgram's study, they came into the research lab with a lifetime of socialization toward the value of scientific research and respect for an experimenter's authority. So, it was believed that they couldn't suddenly step outside of themselves and question the morality of this particular experimenter and his orders. The foot in the door technique is one in which you make small requests which build up to larger requests. In Milgram's study, you started off by administering relatively mild shock levels, but ultimately worked your way up to those that were extremely dangerous. So the gradual increase is what makes that an example of the foot in the door technique. And finally, relaxed moral guard refers to the fact that one common intellectual illusion that hinders critical thinking about obedience is the belief that only evil people do evil things, or that a normal person wouldn't do an evil thing. So, in Milgram's experiment, the experimenter himself looked and acted like a reasonable person who was simply carrying out a research project. He wasn't seen as being, personally corrupt or evil, and so the participants' normal moral guard was down, which seems to be able to maximize obedience. On the other hand, if he was dressed in a more menacing sort of way, we might have seen a much lower likelihood of obeying the authority figure. Okay, now once again, this is social psychology is a topic that has a number of very, very classic studies. Okay, between Milgram's obedience study and Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison study, these are probably 2 of the most memorable psychological research studies that people remember from their first introductory psychology course. So the Stanford prison study, again conducted by Philip Zimbardo, was designed to answer a question about how membership in a particular group will influence behavior. So they recruited in this study 24 individuals from Stanford University who were believed to be well-adjusted young college men. They were paid $15 a day for participating, and the study was supposed to last 2 weeks, and they were told that it was just a simulation of prison life. The students were randomly assigned to either the role of prison guard or prisoner. So the prisoners, they were arrested, they were frisked, photographed, fingerprinted, and booked at the police station. It was really a very realistic replication of what it's like. They were then blindfolded and then driven to the, quote, Stanford prison. It wasn't a real prison, but it was in the basement of Stanford University. And they were then given ID numbers, issued prison clothing, which included tight nylon caps, shapeless gowns, and they were not given underwear, and they were locked in cells. Participants assigned to guards were outfitted with, official-looking uniforms, as you can see in the picture here, billy clubs and whistles, and they were given complete control, essentially. So Zimbardo did not foresee how this study was going to turn out. Although some guards were nicer than others, they all engaged in some abuse of power. That is, the slightest disobedience was punished by often degrading tasks or the loss of privileges, including things like eating, sleeping, and washing. And as demands increased and abuses began, the prisoners became passive and depressed. Only one prisoner fought back with a hunger strike, which then ended by force feeding by the guards. So, again, the key thing here is that these were all believed to be healthy, young adults who were simply randomly assigned to one group or another. And then, depending on what group they were assigned to, there was a drastic change in their behavior. If you were assigned to be a prison guard, you started treating these prisoners very poorly simply because you were given the power to do so. So although this study was designed to last 2 weeks, it actually had to be discontinued after only 6 days because of the alarming psychological changes that were taking place in the participants. In fact, 4 of them had to be released within the first 4 days because of severe psychological reactions. So group membership can have a powerful influence. Another influence has to do with de-individuation, which refers to the reduced self-consciousness, inhibition, and personal responsibility that sometimes occurs in a group, particularly when the members feel anonymous, such as when it's Halloween or people are dressed up. They'll often engage in behaviors because of the feelings of anonymity and being in the group context that they normally would not engage in. As individuals outside of the group. Okay, so we've seen that groups we belong to and the roles that we play within them influence how we think about ourselves, but groups also affect the types of decisions that we make. We might think that being in a group will, result in better decision making than we are capable of making as individuals, because we might suspect intuitively that by being a part of a group, we can hear other people's sides of arguments that we might not necessarily see. Research into the role or the effect of being in a group on decision making has revealed three different effects. One is referred to as the risky shift phenomenon. So after discussing an issue, groups actually support riskier decisions than decisions that were made by the individuals that compose those groups before the discussion. That is, you might be willing to take a certain level of risk, but when you start discussing the issue with somebody else who might be making a similar level of risk, as a group, you two would be more likely to make an even riskier decision than either one of you had made as individuals. The other phenomenon that's been shown to occur in this research is called groupthink. This is when faulty decision making occurs when a highly cohesive group strives for agreement and avoids inconsistent information. Um, and finally, the third phenomenon is called group polarization, which refers to a group's movement toward either riskier or more conservative behavior, depending on the members' initial dominant tendencies. So that is, groups can actually become more or less risky. It depends on what their initial tendencies were. So we've discussed social cognition and social influence, and now we're going to talk a little bit about social relations, or our feelings about others. And in particular, we'll talk a little bit about prejudice, discrimination, altruism, and interpersonal attraction. So when we talk about prejudice, this is a learned, generally negative attitude towards a specific group, or towards specific people, primarily because they are viewed as being members of a particular group. And prejudice has three components. The first is thoughts, which are the stereotypes, right? The difference between stereotypes and prejudice is that the stereotype is the thought. Prejudice is a behavior that we engage in as a result of stereotypes. The second component involves feelings and emotions, or emotions. And the third includes behavioral tendencies, which result in possible discrimination. Now, we probably think that we're aware of our prejudices and our biases, but bias can also be implicit. That is, we talked about implicit memory as being a type of memory that allows us to engage in certain behaviors without having knowledge of having learned them previously. So implicit bias refers to the hidden automatic attitudes that that may serve as a guide to behaviors independent of a person's awareness or control. Research suggests that the major sources of prejudice and discrimination come from learning, personal experience, limited resources, displaced aggression, and mental shortcuts. So in terms of learning, people learn prejudice similar to the way that they learn all attitudes. That is primarily through classical and operant conditioning, as well as social learning. For example, repeated exposure to stereotypical portrayals of certain groups makes us more likely to develop those things. Similarly, hearing our parents, friends, or other important individuals express prejudice also reinforces prejudice. Our personal experience can also have an impact on this. That is, people develop prejudice through direct experience. For example, when people make prejudicial remarks or jokes, they sometimes gain attention and even approval from others, and so that can actually be reinforcing, and also unfortunately, denigrating others also seems to boost one's self-esteem. In fact, this may be one of the reasons behind childhood bullying as well. In terms of limited resources, most people understand that prejudice and discrimination exact a high price on their victims, but most people don't acknowledge the economic and political advantages that they offer to the dominant group. For example, the stereotype that some minority group members are inferior to others may actually help justify and perpetuate the social order that exists in the United States. In terms of displaced aggression, frustration sometimes leads people to attack the source of frustration. In fact, this has been referred to previously as the frustration aggression law, the idea that people behave aggressively because they become frustrated. There's strong historical evidence for the fact that when the cause of frustration is ambiguous, people often redirect their aggression toward an alternative, potentially innocent target, which sometimes is referred to as the scapegoat. And finally, mental shortcuts refer to the fact that Prejudice sometimes comes from normal attempts to simplify a complex world. Stereotypes allow people to make quick judgments about others that they don't know, and this allows us to free up mental resources to engage in other activities. In fact, stereotypes and prejudice can occur without a person's conscious awareness. This is what I previously referred to as implicit bias. Now, because of the fact that we tend to classify ourselves as being members of certain groups and not members of other groups, we tend to create what are called in-groups and out-groups. An in-group is just any category that people see themselves as belonging to, and an out-group is any other category. So, if I, were to divide up a class of students into 3 groups, group 1 would be, members of that group, would consider them, the other members in their group, part of the in-group. But anyone who is a member of group 2 or 3 would be considered an out-group. And interesting things happen when you even randomly assign people to be in different groups. Research has shown that people tend to judge in-group members as being more attractive, having better personalities, and so on, which is referred to as a phenomenon called in-group favoritism. People also tend to recognize greater diversity among members of their in-group than do members of out-groups. So if a member of an out-group does something, you assume that everyone else in that group also engages in that behavior. Whereas if a member of your in-group engages in a behavior, you don't necessarily assume that all members of your in-group engage in that behavior as well. So you judge members of you judge the members of out-groups as being more homogeneous than they really are. So, given that prejudice and discrimination are so prevalent among human beings, the question then becomes, what can we do in order to try to reduce prejudice? And there have been 4 major approaches that have been suggested: cooperation and common goals, intergroup contact, cognitive retraining, and cognitive dissonance. So, cooperation and common goals. Research has shown that one of the best ways to combat prejudice is to encourage cooperation rather than competition among groups. Once again, classic study done by a psychologist named Muzafer Sharif in the 1960s conducted an experiment with a group of 11 and 12-year-old boys at a summer camp. They divided the boys up into different groups, and they found that when they had them engage in competitions with one another, they would they would begin to, as the competition increased, the boys in the groups would act violently and aggressive toward the other members. But when they were given what's called a superordinate goal, meaning that this is a crisis comes up and groups have to work together because in this case, I'll just give you the example of what happened in the Sharif study. There was a shutoff of the water supply to the camp, and so this affected people, the boys in both groups. So now they had this common goal, the superordinate goal, that they need to get the water restored. And because this was set up by the researchers, they made it so that the members of just one group working by themselves couldn't solve the problem, that they had to actually work together. And they found that when they cooperated and had common goals, this reduced these prejudicial and discriminatory behaviors. Intergroup contact is a second approach that can reduce prejudice between groups. Sometimes this can actually backfire. Increasing contact generally only works under certain conditions that provide for close interaction and interdependence. As I said, when there are superordinate goals, for instance, that require cooperation, and when the members of the groups are believed to be equal status. But once people generally have positive experiences with the group, they tend to generalize those experiences to other groups as well. Now, in terms of cognitive training, this is one of the more recent strategies in terms of attempts to reduce prejudice, where it requires people to take others' perspectives. That is, to empathize with other people's situations, and by taking other people's perspectives, that in and of itself, imagining how other people feel and what they experience, that's also been shown to reduce prejudice. And finally, cognitive dissonance, which we talked about earlier, is also an efficient method of changing attitudes. So each time we meet somebody who does not conform to our prejudicial views, we experience dissonance. And to resolve the dissonance, we can, either maintain our stereotypes, or, if we continue to contact more and more individuals that fail to conform to our prejudiced view, then eventually, our attitude will need to change toward them in order to match our behavior. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about aggression, which is generally any behavior that's intended to harm someone. And of course, there are both biological as well as psychosocial factors. In fact, previously I mentioned the frustration-aggression hypothesis. But in terms of the biological factors, some psychologists would argue that because aggression has such a long history, it's really found in all cultures. Some researchers would argue that it's relatively instinctive, that it's something that we're predisposed to because of our genetic makeup. And in fact, there is now evidence that individuals are sometimes genetically predisposed to be more aggressive than others. That is, genetic factors using the research studies that we've talked about previously, adoption and twin studies suggest that our genetic makeup does influence our level of aggression. In terms of the brain, we have seen where certain brain injuries can actually increase aggression. That is, both experimentally induced brain injuries in certain animals can increase aggression, and also hormones and neurotransmitters, in particular the male testosterone, hormone testosterone has been probably the most heavily implicated hormone, but that's actually relatively controversial. The research jury is not in completely on the exact role of testosterone and aggression. Sure, we've seen it in the media that males who take anabolic steroids, which increase these male hormones, sometimes engage in violent acts, but there's been a number of studies that have failed to find this association between testosterone and aggression. So it may be the case that it's more at the extremes, such that somebody who is predisposed to behave aggressively when exposed to high levels of testosterone, that might sort of bring it out even more so than normal. But in an individual who's maybe not predisposed to that level of aggression, it might have no effect. So more research really needs to be done on that. In terms of some of the psychosocial factors, substance abuse, particularly alcohol, is related to aggression. Aversive stimuli, such as loud noises or pain, has also been shown to increase aggression. As I talked about previously, the frustration-aggression law developed by John Dollard and colleagues suggests that frustration creates anger, which then leads, for some at least, to engage in aggressive behavior. Then, of course, we've probably all heard about the role of the media in violence. This is another area that has received a lot of research, but it's not exactly clear to what degree the media actually is responsible for triggering aggression. That is, sure, you've probably heard that playing violent video games may predispose people to act aggressively, but it's not clear in many of those cases whether it's playing violent video games that leads to aggression, or whether aggressive people are just more likely to play violent video games, right? That goes back to something we talked about very early on in this course, that you should try to remember for the rest of your life, that correlation does not imply causation. And finally, culture and learning both have a role in terms of aggression. We saw this in another one of the classic studies on the Bandura Bobo doll experiment, where children who saw an aggressive adult also behaved aggressively when they were given an opportunity to play with the same toys. So, in terms of clarifying some of the research findings relating to aggression, one is that although some people believe that expressing your aggression, such as hitting a pillow or screaming, can actually reduce aggression, research studies actually show that that doesn't help, and in fact it may intensify feelings of aggression. A more effective approach is to introduce incompatible responses. Incompatible responses include certain emotional responses, such as empathy and humor. It's difficult to act aggressively toward an individual when you are attempting to empathize with them. That is, you're attempting to understand their perspective and what their experiences are. And finally, improving social and communication skills can also help to reduce aggression. Now, in terms of altruism, altruism is a form of pro-social behavior. It refers specifically to the actions that one engages in that are designed to help others with no obvious benefit to the helper. And there are three key approaches to explaining why we help. One is the evolutionary perspective, one is the egoistic, and one is the empathy altruism hypothesis. So, evolutionary factors might argue that the reason that we help other people is because it actually benefits our own genes. So they would argue that altruism is an instinctual behavior that simply evolved because it favors the survival of our own genes. So by helping other individuals who are related to us and who share genes in common with us, by helping them, we actually are helping ourselves as well. From the egoistic perspective, this model proposes that the reason that we behave altruistically is because we're motivated by anticipated gain. That is, we may help others only because we expect that later on that help will be reciprocated. That is, others will pay us back, or because it makes us feel virtuous, or perhaps even because it helps us avoid feeling guilty ourselves for not helping. And finally, the empathy altruism hypothesis suggests that simply seeing or hearing another person's suffering can create empathy. That is, this is the subjective experience that we have where we experience something similar to what someone else is experiencing. So if somebody were to tell us a sad story, they would feel sad while they're telling it, but we might also start to begin feeling sad as well, and that's what empathy is. And when we start experiencing someone else's experience, we may then be motivated to help that person for his or her own sake. Now, in addition to understanding what are the factors that make people want to help, and as in the case of altruism, psychologists have also been interested in some of the factors that can explain why we don't help. And this was prompted by a very famous case of a woman who is known by the name Kitty Genovese, who was murdered in Queens in March 1964. Now, there's some controversy surrounding the exact details of this murder, but basically, it was reported in the newspaper that a number of people, perhaps somewhere around 30 people, may have been aware of the attack that was going on when Kitty Genovese was murdered, because it was occurring outside of an apartment complex, and the windows were open, and it was very loud, and she was attacked not once but actually twice, and no one had reported this to the police, and so this prompted social psychologists Latanya and Darley to ask the question of, why did people not help? And so they conducted a series of research studies. And based on their research, they had concluded that there's a five-step model that can explain what the likelihood that people are going to help will be. In part, they explained that part of the reason that people do not help in situations has to do with diffusion of responsibility. That is, if you don't feel personally responsible for acting, this may actually spread to other members of the group as well. We might take the perspective that we expect somebody else will help, and so we don't feel personally responsible. So in this model, the first step is that we have to notice the incident, of course. The second step then is that we have to interpret the event as an emergency, right? And so if the answer to any of these questions is no at any point, no help will be given. After we interpret it as an emergency, then we need to accept personal responsibility for helping. Although that's not sufficient, we also need to know how to help. And then even if we know how to help, we have to finally make that decision to help. And it's really only if, according to this model anyway, each of these 5 steps is answered affirmatively that helping behavior actually results. Another area that social psychologists have investigated has to do with interpersonal attraction. That is, what causes us to feel admiration, liking, friendship, intimacy toward other people. There have been 3 key factors that have been identified. Physical attractiveness, proximity, and similarity all seem to be quite important in terms of determining who we are interpersonally attracted to. So in terms of proximity, this just refers to the fact that people that are nearer to us we're more interpersonally attracted toward. So simply being around somebody over time can make you more attracted toward that person. In terms of similarity, that sort of argues against a popular saying that you might hear that opposites attract. It may be the case that when people are different in some factors, that they're attracted toward one another, and that's usually the case when these are complementary opposites. But in fact, when it comes to key values that people hold, things that are really important to them in life, it's really the case that opposites do not attract, and that people who are more similar to one another are more likely to be attracted toward one another. So although those 3 key factors are all involved, physical attractiveness appears to be the most important factor in initial liking. That is how we look in terms of our physical characteristics, face, body size, shape, and even our dress. This is a very important factor early on in determining whom we are attracted to. There's been a great deal of research looking at the influence of physical attractiveness on the way that people are rated. So physically attractive people of all ages receive more positive interactions, they tend to be more successful, and they also tend to have health benefits. Perceived attractiveness is also influenced by non-physical traits as well, but they're generally just rated as being more poised, more interesting, more cooperative, more achieving, more sociable, more intelligent, and more healthy. And the matching hypothesis attempts to explain sort of why there tends to be a certain degree of congruence between the attractiveness of people. That is, people of equal attractiveness tend to select one another as partners, because obviously attractiveness is something that varies from individual to individual. Now, there are some universals that can be seen in terms of the factors that determine attractiveness. So, in terms of men and women, they look for somewhat different things. Men look for men. It's important for women that men show maturity, ambitiousness, and financial resources, as these suggest that the partner will be supportive for the individual and the family. In terms of women, men are interested in looks and youth, as these are associated with fertility. But at the same time, there are some cultural differences. So, as I've mentioned many times before, when it comes to the degree to which something is more culturally defined versus the degree to which it's more universal, that is independent of culture, is sort of like the nature-nurture debate. It's a combination of both of these things, that what is beautiful is partially determined by culture, but there are also some universal factors that determine what's attractive and what's not as well. So, as I mentioned, in terms of proximity, attraction is based to some extent on geographical closeness, and it's an important factor for initial liking as well. And that simply being repeatedly exposed to an individual increases liking unless it's a negative stimulus. That is, if you're exposed to somebody whom you find to be abrasive, the more you're exposed to that person, the less you'll like that person over time. But for individuals that are at least neutral, simply being exposed to them will result in increased ratings of liking over time. And as I mentioned before, similarity is also a major factor, particularly in long-term relationships. People prefer similarity in many different aspects of life and personhood. We've heard both the saying that birds of a feather flock together, as well as opposites attract. And as I mentioned earlier, lovers can have some differences, particularly those that are seen as complementary to one another, where, if I am lacking in a trait that is seen as desirable, but my partner has that trait, that's complementary. But if we are dissimilar on key important factors, things that are really important to us as individuals, then it's unlikely that long-term relationships will be sustained over time. So generally, the more alike people are, the more their liking tends to endure. Now, in terms of explaining love, we've seen Sternberg come up with a model before. He had a triarchic theory of intelligence, and now he also has a triangular theory of love, where he suggests that there are these three components of love: intimacy, passion, and commitment, and that the ultimate type of love, the type that is considered to be most satisfactory and the one that is most likely to result in a long-term commitment, is called consummate love, which is a combination of intimacy, passion, and commitment. So he would argue that if you just have one of these types of love toward your partner, this will not result in a long-term loving relationship. So if you just have intimacy, that results in liking, but you may lack commitment and passion. Passion by itself will lead to infatuation. These might be the sort of shorter term relationships that you're engaged in when you're highly attracted to someone, but without the commitment and the intimacy factors, once again, it's unlikely to sustain itself. And then finally, even with commitment in the absence of the other two, sort of just saying we'll stay together no matter what, but without those other two components, again, it's difficult for those relationships to sustain. Now, research also suggests that love can be dichotomized into two different types: a romantic type and a companionate type. And as you can see in the graph here, they tend to have two different trajectories over the course of the relationship. So romantic love is the intense feeling of attraction to another with an erotic context and with future expectations. It's been shown to be near universal. That is, in the majority of cultures that have been studied, this type of love can be seen. However, it is typically shorter lived. It's largely based on mystery and fantasy, and interference can actually increase these feelings. That is sometimes when an individual is seen as harder to get, that can actually increase our feelings of romantic love toward them. Companion love, on the other hand, is a strong, lasting attraction based more on admiration, respect, trust, deep caring, and commitment. And research, as I said, shows that this type of love actually grows stronger with time. And it's important in terms of maintaining the relationship so that we overlook one another's faults. Because as anyone who's been in a long-term relationship will tell you, it usually requires work, that is, sustained relationships. And so it's important to overlook one another's faults in order to save a relationship.